Bonjour, je suis not manly, et ici le voyage d'espace, je ne sais quoi. And if you're wondering why I've been away for so long, this is why. This is Eve, the second planet of the system. 4,000 kilometers diameter on average, 1.4 g surface gravity, and an atmosphere that is 10 atmospheres pressure at sea level. My goodness. One solar day is about the same as stock Eve, 22 hours. Orbit period is a lot more like the real-life Venus, and so is the inclination. It's been toned down a lot more, so getting there is more like Eve than Venus, fortunately. Delta V to get out here, you need just over 1.7 kilometers per second to get out here, and a little more than 2 to 2.3 kilometers per second to capture. Landing and getting back from landing is considerably tougher at 7 kilometers per second. It is, however, a very easy target with lots of ocean and lake biomes, a very large science multiplier, and breathtaking views from the peaks and plateaus. The problem is that double sea level pressure compared to stock is going to require specialized engines to take off from. Very high orbital speeds will make landing very difficult as well. We're sending up a rocket very similar to what we sent up to Moho. The contents of that payload bay, however, are considerably different. We've got a science kit for high and low space science above Eve. We have also 3 relay satellites that we're going to put up in synchronous orbit above the surface of Eve so that we'll maintain contact with our surface craft. There we go. We've also got a Rover mate on there to help us find anomalies on both Eve and on Gilly. There's our relay sats. We've also got a rover that we're going to leave in that fairing until we get into Eve's atmosphere. We're making use of the 10-meter heat shield for this. It's really the only way we can get down there. We have a refueling craft that will help us get from Eve orbit to Gilly and eventually back to Kerbin. That lower stage is fully refueled so that we can send it up later. And here we've got the lander with explodium-breathing engines, with intakes and engines that use oxidizer instead of liquid fuel, kind of a reverse jet engine. We're lining up all of our craft one by one to eject from Kerbin. We're going out to, here we go, about 30,000 kilometers up. It's mostly the same approach for all of these, and we're going to deposit this chemical rocket stage back on the surface of Kerbin so we don't have any more space junk. We're able to avoid the trouble we ran into back at Moho. Planning the ejection is pretty easy. It's not hard to get to Eve. The problem is making sure your inclination is acceptable when you get out there. So we're going to do a course correction out there at the ascending node later. One by one, I'm using Kerbal Alarm Clock to help plan these maneuvers to make sure I don't miss the ejection for any one of these. Starting with the main mission craft, then the lander, then the refueler, and finally the rover. In spite of the order I launched these things, the rover is going to be first. And there we go, there's our little flotilla of craft. Without Kerbal Alarm Clock, it would be rather difficult to manage a mission this complex. But we do have it, go get it. The problem I'm going to have, though, is when this lander approaches, I think we're going to get cut off by Eve. So what I'm doing here is I am turning off several tanks. I'm going to reduce the amount of Delta V this craft has, just in case we lose signal, so that way the craft runs out of Delta V shorter than it would have, and we don't waste a bunch of fuel. So we've got about 1 kilometer per second. We'll adjust our insertion maneuver to be about 1 kilometer per second. Here is the main mission craft. Here we go, we're going to send out Roberta Lynn Kerman just in a moment to gather the science from these instruments. We are now high above Eve, and there's that bright dot just in the middle, top right there. We're directly above the Sea of Gojira. Oh, I hope the Galileo team doesn't run into any copyright infringement issues. There we go. Now, some of the instruments we have here are going to require 2 readings, not just the Mystery Goo and Science Junior, but that Gravioli detector now as well. We'll also have an atmosphere spectro whatever on the lander, on the rover, and we'll have a seismometer on there as well. Speaking of the rover, here it is on its first approach to Eve, and our first close look at this giant from a distance. Look at that. It might look like Venus, but don't worry, you can still land on it. It's not like 400 Celsius down there, fortunately. My goodness. Huh. Well, Eve, we're gonna settle in for an extended stay right here. Here goes that orbit insertion, but we are going to lose signal just because we're gonna fall behind the main mission craft. There we go. We've been cut off from Eve, but that's okay. As long as our engines don't overheat, we're gonna be fine. Come on. Oh, there we go. We've run out of allocated fuel, but that's okay. Once we get our signal back, we can clean that up and make this more approachable. In the meantime, the main mission craft is looking for anomalies on the surface. We do, however, have several seas. Sea of Rodin, Sea of Nessus, the Sea of Gojira, and the Sea of Ghidorah, I think. There are lots and lots of different ocean and lake biomes here on the surface of Eve. We're going to do a pretty elliptical orbit for the majority of these until we can get our relay satellites up. The lander ends up being a different problem entirely because we lose signal before we can even execute the burn. Fortunately, we do get out of Eve's shadow not too far from the maneuver node, so all we gotta do is close orbit and we should be okay with the lander. Come on, there we go. We will fix the inclination for these various crafts later on. Finally, we have the refueler, which has its own relay antennas, so it should have no problem staying in contact with Kerbin as we do this insertion. All done. Now, the main mission craft is getting ready to insert its satellites into synchronous orbit. We're going to do an orbit period roughly about 2/3 of what Eve's rotational time is. To do a stationary orbit on Eve, you need an altitude of 19.195 kilometers, and an orbital period of exactly 22 hours and 30 minutes. To do the insertion, though, you divide that by the number of satellites and, well, okay, you see the math on the screen there. The mothership has an orbital period of 15 hours exactly in this case, and we drop our satellites off one at a time, so that we end up with a triangle of satellites. Here comes the first one. These don't require a lot of delta V to finish their synchronous orbit, so hey, they're just tiny craft with tiny fuel tanks. I made use of that Mark II drone core because it has at least a 50% chance of detecting anomalies, and it has almost everything you would need. We use an RTG generator on there in case we fall behind Eve's shadow. So we don't lose signal, we don't lose power or anything. With the last of the satellites almost deployed, we can then bring the main mission craft down to low Eve orbit. Look at that. Orbital period is only off by fractions of a second for each of these, and we have a nice little triangular arrangement. It's now time to bring the main mission craft down to low Eve orbit. We go to about 100 kilometers up. That's nice and safe. Here's the lander, and take a look at that surface. The cloud layer got a little glitched out, so take a good look. This may be the only time you'll get to see Eve's surface from this high up. Here's Scatterer doing its thing for a gorgeous Eve sunset. Same problem as we had back at Kerbin, but that's okay. It still looks beautiful. Now we're almost out of delta V here on the lander's insertion craft, so we're going to eject these extra nuclear boosters here, and we're going to finish the insertion on a single nuclear booster. That's going to make for some pretty long burn times, but that's okay, you don't have to see that. As long as we get these things into Eve's atmosphere, we'll avoid leaving space junk above, the surface of this beauty. And there we go. Now comes the tough part. While we do have 1.4 kilometers per second to do this insertion, the burn times are going to be in the tens of minutes, as you can see there. So yeah, we're not going to do that in one burn. We're going to end up doing it in a few burns, just as we get lower and lower and lower, until we get down to a more reasonable 4-minute burn. You can barely see the dot there. Now the targeting marker's up. That is the main mission craft there, and we are approaching it. As long as we get within 100 meters, say, then Roberta and Chris can EVA over to the lander. We don't have any docking ports on this, so we're going to have to make do with EVA jetpacks. Oh, thank goodness. And with 600 meters per second remaining, that is enough to deorbit this craft. We send out Roberta Lynn Kerman first. Roberta, Chris, and Julie don't have any interplanetary experience yet. This will pretty much set them up for all future missions. They'll have all the experience they need. That lander actually has 2 Mark I pods aboard there. One of them is shielded by a fairing, so that we can tuck Roberta and Chris in there, and without having a big bulb on the top of there. I tried designs that had the Mark II pod up there, but the bulbous part on there just added too much drag, and, well, I had too many problems controlling that craft. This slightly modified design by Matt Lown was a lot more effective. Now that we've sorted out the engine and signal issue, we can properly bring the rover down to low Eve orbit. We end up using our satellites to look for a good landing spot. There's this whole half of the planet where the equator is covered in oceans. We do not want to touch that, so I end up placing markers at each end of the ocean so that I can avoid landing in those areas. The Eve anomaly is right in the middle of that. There's the start of the landing zone. The Eve object is actually over there, just to the south of one of the seas. Okay, here comes the deorbit. We ended up lowering the orbit to about 65k so that we wouldn't have to deal with quite such high speeds. But as you'll see, that, well, we don't know if it was enough yet. But that nuclear engine is now at its end of life. We will deposit it in Eve's atmosphere, and we'll not have to worry about it again. And we'll use that 10-meter heat shield to bring us through Eve's atmosphere, well, somewhat safely. Look at that, there's a little plateau down there. There are plenty of those on or near Eve's equator. If you can plan a more precision landing, you can use stock engines, because Kerbal-designed craft will do better at 10 kilometers up. But hey, we planned for any eventuality with this particular design, so we've got explodium-breathing engines that actually thrive in the lower depths of Eve. You take a look at that skin temperature for the 10-meter heat shield. It has a top limit of 3,500 Kelvin, and we get very, very, very close to that. I would say descending from low Eve orbit is at the limit of the 10-meter heat shield for this system. Stock Eve, it'd be no problem, but JNSQ Eve, we're at the upper limits of this heat shield. I don't think we're going to use it in any more missions. As we get into the lower depths of the atmosphere, G-forces increase considerably, and Chris is having a hard time maintaining attitude on this thing. Roberta's already knocked out due to G-forces. Chris here, he knows how to fly. Not a problem. And there we go, Roberta is back. I end up turning SAS off and opening the chutes to try to stop on that spin. Thank goodness. I had tested and tested and retested and redesigned and retested this craft over and over again, and this final design here was the most successful. I end up hanging on to the heat shield until those chutes open because we don't want to collide into the heat shield after. There's just one problem, we end up colliding with the shield anyway. My goodness, look at that. We are deep in the depths of Eve's atmosphere. Atmosphere density is already 8 times that of sea level currently. sea level Kerbin. Sea level Kerbin! Now, the heat shield at least exploded on impact, but that debris on the ground is going to give us trouble. Not to mention that the slope of 8.8 degrees is going to pose a problem. When I tested this craft, it was able to land on a slope of up to 7 degrees. I wasn't able to plan for an 8-degree slope. Well, let's see what happens. Come on. Come on, Chris. You can touch this thing down. End up landing right on top of that container, and well, that was the end of that. Bye-bye, guys. Well. Fortunately, I do know the quick save option and I don't have to rely on Matt Lowndes' blunderbirds for this. Fortunately, something caught an edge of the heat shield and was able to tuck it away off to the side this time. There we go. There, the heat shield falls harmlessly away from our target landing spot, and the slope is a much more reasonable 5 degrees. We should be able to touch this thing down now. Here we go. Come on, Chris. You can do this. Touchdown and... Come on, stay up. And we stayed up! Hey! Congratulations, Chris Kerbin, landing on the surface of Eve. Now it's time to bring the rover down to the surface. This ended up being a much easier landing. We actually have 2 heat shields, just in case this thing flips orientation, and we're going to keep the rover inside that fairing until we are safely within Eve's atmosphere. We do lose signal, but I was able to turn SAS off before we did, and then this thing safely drifted through the rest of the re-entry. There we go. Thank goodness for that. Finally, we're low enough we can deploy the fairing, we can deploy the parachutes, and then we can eject the heat shields. Whoop. Oh dear. We lose the headlights and we lose that front reaction wheel. But hey, we can touch down safe. I ended up redoing this later on, but the other shots didn't work out so well, so I'll just use this as a representative landing, and then I'll reload this to do a better job of landing the rover. In the meantime, we're going to send Chris out there. He's going to plant a flag, but not for posterity in this case. He's going to plant a flag as a destination for the Bon Voyage module on that rover. Remember last time we ended up pretty much right underneath the craft? Back on Minmus? Well, here, if we ended up underneath a flag, who cares? The flag blows up and that's it. We just plant another one. We might as well quickly check our ladders, make sure we can get in and out of the craft. Hey, there we go. You can get this far, you can get back inside the craft. So Chris and Roberta are going to wait safely inside while the rover travels back. A subjective moment later and the rover arrives right next to the lander. There we go. We got a year and 40 days to complete this. The walking animations got a little funny at this point. I think it was time to stop and reload the game. Try to fix that up. In the meantime, we got a little bit of basic science. We also picked up some science during the descent for the rover. So we got some upper atmosphere science and we got some lower atmosphere science. Okay, we'll bring Roberta up to the upper pod and we can bring her down. I don't know what's up with female Kerbals. I tested these ladders with Chris and with Doug Kerman. I didn't get a chance to test with Roberta, and I'm not sure what happened here, but she just couldn't grab onto the next stage of that ladder. I tried letting go and grabbing quickly, but I was not quick enough, and she fell on top of the explodium intake. But when she was able to grab that, oh well, there we go. Graceful ladder transfer there. Fortunately, Roberta gets away from that safely. And there we go. A little bit of traveling later. At some points during the mission, the craft ended up in some pretty strange states, with some parts misaligned and the wheels not all touching, and, well, a few other things happened. Fortunately, a quick jolt of 5x time warp fixes that. I'm not sure why that works, but it works. And pretty much that kept our mission alive through the whole play. Here we are in the Midlands. That boulder didn't offer any extra science for that scanning arm, but we did manage to find this little stone here, this volcanic rock. Volcanic rock on Eve is something we can pick up and take back. So once we come to a stop here, we'll send out Roberta with a pickaxe and we'll go grab some volcanic rock. This stuff is also good for the arm scanner, but for some reason the scanner was mounted too high off the ground, and it could not pick up this stone. But that's okay. Roberta here can pick it up herself and we can bring it back home. 240 science, not as much as Moho, but still pretty good. What just happened there? Bon Voyage. This is why you save before every Bon Voyage run. Oh well. Anyway, a quick reload later, and we end up properly in the Highlands to get some more science. Okay, look at that. Look at the clouds, look at the nearby mountains. We're kind of in a depression in between the mountains, but that's okay. A little more driving later, we end up on the shores, and near this rather interesting looking formation. I would have figured that these sharp edges would have been weathered down by Eve's really high and hot winds, but hey, let's get a good scan of this thing. Not bad. Not bad at all. 360 science. This craft is also a watercraft. We have those Hades explodium-breathing engines there and a pair of small intakes. We can send this craft out into the water. I suppose you could call it water. Explodium-breathing engines does work on this version of JNSQ Eve, not a problem. So we venture out into the water. Bon Voyage also has an aquatic travel mode as well, but I think it gets the fuel usage calculations wrong, or at least it doesn't know what to do with explodium-breathing engines because they are far more efficient than what this thing could suggest. We're only at 25% throttle and we're maintaining a speed of 100 kilometers per hour over the surface of the water. We do get out past the shores, out to the Sea of Gojira, and we get some science out here. I thought about traveling out to all the various lakes and oceans to get some more science. This was a very long and hard slog, so I ended up skipping that part. Although if you take a look at the oxidizer usage, I didn't use very much at all. I suppose I could have turned on infinite fuel, did the trek out to the middle of the seas, took science, come back, and then just deducted the oxidizer from the craft. I don't know, maybe I'll do that next time, but just for the purpose of showing off all the eye candy on Eve, it is not that necessary. So that was the Sea of Gojira! There we go, turn those noisemakers off for a while, and get back to land navigation. Out here in the Midlands, we've got some gorgeous views of some nearby peaks, mesas, and various other things. Plateaus. My goodness, look at that. Isn't that just beautiful? And the clouds. Here we watch a gorgeous Eve sunset from the surface. It's not completely grey, fortunately. It does turn red as it gets lower and lower on the edge there on the horizon, so it's not too bad. And there we go, there's Scatterer doing its usual thing. We come across what the game calls a pancake dome. Now I'm hungry. It's bad enough we had Minmus, and then we had chocolate sprinkles on Moho, now we got pancakes on the surface of Eve. Whoever thought that this looked like pancakes probably won an award or something. I don't know. We eventually get out to the Eve anomaly, and it ends up being a random monolith, but why is it floating off the ground there? I thought all the random monoliths had snap to surface turned on. I really need to go check the configuration for JNSQ. Between this and the sunken moon monolith, I'm wondering if some of these things need to get fixed. It's okay, Galileo team, I still love you guys. We mark the monolith with the flag, so that we know to come back to it at least. So if they want to look at this save and find out what's going on, hey Galileo team, I can send you this save. Here's where the monolith is. Our next stop is at one of the really high plateaus. This is in the mountains, and it's actually a very high plateau, 10 kilometers up. This is just gorgeous. Pressure here is a much more reasonable 115 kilopascals, much more like Kerbin here. Gravity is still pretty high, 1.38 Gs, but hey, that's survivable. You could live on that. Temperatures also, they are a much more comfortable 319 Kelvin or 46 C. There are plenty of these along the equator, so hey, take advantage. And finally, several days later, we set Bon Voyage to about 1 kilometer away from the lander, and we approach the lander carefully and then come to a stop. This is the end of our surface journey, fortunately. That was a long, hard slog. But the hardest part is yet to come. We have to somehow get this thing from the surface, from the deep surface, back up into low Eve orbit. Fortunately, Roberta has no problem getting up the ladder, even if she couldn't get back down. Dropping off all the science that we gathered. We gathered 2 copies of many things. Chris brings the other batch of science, but then he realized, wait a minute, we're not quite done yet. We have to plant our real flag. There we go. The final boss. Eve has been called the final boss in stock Kerbal Space Program. In JNSQ, it is very much the final boss. Trying to reduce drag by ejecting unnecessary parts. And then, well, I've practiced this takeoff lots and lots of times, but it does not make this any less tense. And there we go. Those Sphinx turbofans have a wet mode which has an afterburner and has a very, very high thrust to weight. Actually, the thicker the air, the more benefit you get from these engines. They are great for ascending. Not so great for accelerating though, so we have to go sideways pretty quickly, so we risk pretty high dynamic pressures on ascent. And we're trying to pick up as much horizontal speed as we can on these, so we don't waste rocket delta V trying to pick up that horizontal speed. It looks pretty good so far. You notice that those nacelles have a liquid fuel tank as well. I try to ride that Vector liquid fuel engine off the nacelles for as long as I can before detaching them. Try to get as much delta V as I can out of the Vector stage. I don't know what happened here, but even in spite of my tests, I think I went a little too far. Yeah. Probably... oh well. Probably too much angle of attack there, but that's okay. With the power of quick saving, we can try this again. I try to be a little more careful. That DPCR setting in Ferrum Aerospace will help you avoid cranking the controls too hard and having your craft come apart. There we go. Now we start our Vector liquid fuel engine stage. We're starting to lose thrust to weight on those Sphinxes. As soon as we expend all the liquid fuel in the external tanks, we will ditch those and the engines, and we'll ride up on the Vectors. Put those in dry mode to make sure they do not reignite on us. And there they go. The Vector has an extremely high thrust to weight. It's most important to get as much horizontal speed as we can before we exit Eve's atmosphere if we can. We end up getting a little bit of heating effects there, but not enough to really worry about. Oh, my goodness. I'd like to think that the hard part is over. I dial back, so our thrust to weight's about 1. There we go. We lose that, and we're on the Terrier. We are high enough up that the Terrier has full thrust and full specific impulse. Oh, do we have enough delta V to close orbit? Let's find out. Oh, look at that. Yes, we do! We're gonna make it! We're gonna make it off the surface of Eve with a 70 by 70 orbit. Congratulations, Chris and Roberta Lynn Kernman, you have survived! We will meet up with the mission craft and head out to Gilly in the next episode. Until then, I'm not Manly. Fly safe.